I sell the most cheapest meat of the best quality and quantity in this market. My meat comes from a source that none of you all can ever know. When I sell, they all buy, never knew what meat they are buying. Do you want to know how and where I get my meat from? Okay, follow me on this story and find out, but be warned, my secret might knock you off your seat.
In the village of Ojo, there was a popular market called Ojo. In that market, there lived a man named Mr. Ode, who was a butcher. Ojo was a peaceful community until Mr. Ode arrived. Ode was a man in his late 40s, and he had no wife or children, so he lived alone. He sold the largest pieces of meat for the cheapest prices. Everyone in the village mainly bought from Mr. Ode. He arrived at the market with bags of meat and sold all of them before the day ended. This made other butchers in the market very envious of him, and at the same time, they were surprised. They wondered where he could get such quality meat and sell it at such a cheap price. The strangest thing about Mr. Ode was what he did with his money. Ode made bags of money from his meat sales, but he never ate good food or wore clean or new clothes. Despite all the money he made, he still wore rags. This caught the attention of another butcher in the market named Mrs. Bisi. Bisi knew he made a lot of money and was surprised at the way he took care of himself. She was determined to find out what Mr. Ode did with his money. At the close of the market one fateful day, Ode packed up and set to head home. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bisi had been waiting all the time so she could follow Mr. Ode. Mr. Ode set off on his journey, and Bisi was secretly behind him. Ode didn't realize that he was being followed. After a short while, Ode arrived home. He used his key to open the door and walked inside his house. Mrs. Bisi began to peek inside Ade's home through the window. The house appeared to be smelling. Then Mr. Ode walked up to a very big black pot. He opened it. "I think I need to supply more meat because I'm running out of supply," Mr. Ode said, and then closed the pot. Mrs. Bisi was curious to know what was inside that black pot. It could be that the pot was what was supplying him with so much meat, she thought to herself. She waited for Mr. Ode to step out of the room. Immediately he stepped out of the room, Mrs. Bisi opened the pot and gasped. Inside, she saw a strange, dark substance that looked like nothing she had ever seen before. It had an eerie glow, and a foul smell emanated from it. Just then, she heard Mr. Ade's footsteps approaching. She quickly closed the pot and hid behind a curtain. Mr. Ode entered the room, humming to himself. He walked past the curtain, not noticing Mrs. Bisi, and left the house again. Bisi let out a sigh of relief and hurried out of the house. She couldn't believe what she had just seen and knew she had to find out more about Mr. Ade's secret. The next day at the market, Mrs. Bisi tried to act normal, but she couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. She kept glancing over at Mr. Ode, who was busy selling his meat as usual. He seemed to be in a good mood, smiling and chatting with customers. As the day went on, Mrs. Bisi felt more curious about what she had seen in Mr. Ade's house. She decided to confide in her best friend, Mrs. Bola. That evening, she went to Bola's house and told her everything. "My friend, I am in big trouble. I am confused. You remember the butcher Mr. Ode at the market? I followed him to his house yesterday, and you won't believe what my eyes saw," Mrs. Bisi said. Bola's eyes widened. "What did you see?" Mrs. Bisi narrated everything she had seen in Mr. Ade's house. Bola was shocked but agreed that they needed to find out more before going to the authorities. They decided to take turns following Mr. Ode and gathering evidence of his suspicious activities. The next few days, they followed Mr. Ode closely. They noticed that he always went to a particular place at night, but they couldn't summon the courage to follow him. One night, it was Bola's turn to follow Ode. She watched as he left the market and headed home. She stayed hidden, keeping a safe distance. When Ade entered his house, Bola quietly crept up to the window. She saw Ade in the kitchen, chopping up what looked like pieces of meat. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the meat looked very strange, just like what Mrs. Bisi had described. Suddenly, Ade turned and looked directly at the window. Bola ducked down quickly, her heart racing. Had he seen her? She held her breath, praying that he had not seen her. After a few minutes, she dared to peek again. Ade was no longer in the kitchen. She heard footsteps approaching the window and panicked. Without thinking, she ran away, not stopping until she reached Mrs. Bisi's house. Breathing heavily, she locked the door and sat down to think. "We have to do something," Bola said to Bisi. "But who would believe us? We need more concrete evidence." The next day, they decided to set a trap for Mr. Ode. Bola approached Ode at the market. "Mr. Ode," she said sweetly, "I've heard you have the best meat in town. I would like to place a special order for a large amount of meat for a big family party." Ode smiled. "Of course, Mrs. Bola. How much do you need?" Bola gave him an amount that she knew would require him to restock his supply. "Can you have it ready by tomorrow evening?" "Absolutely," Ode replied. "I will make sure it's the best meat you've ever had." That evening, Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola followed Ode again. As they suspected, he left his house late at night, carrying a large sack. They followed him to the outskirts of the village, where he disappeared into the woods. They waited for what felt like hours. Finally, Ode emerged from the woods, dragging the heavy sack behind him. He made his way back to his house, and the two women watched as he entered. The next day, Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola knew they had to act quickly. They went to the market and tried to behave as usual. However, their eyes were constantly on Mr. Ode, who was busy selling his meat. They noticed that Ode seemed unusually cheerful that day. As evening approached, Bola and Bisi met up to discuss their plan. They decided to confront Mr. Ode directly, but they needed to catch him in the act. They contacted the local police and explained their suspicions. The police were skeptical but agreed to help investigate due to the seriousness of the allegations. That night, the police, along with Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola, waited near Ade's house. As expected, Mr. Ode left his house with a large sack. The group followed him silently, keeping a safe distance. They watched as he disappeared into the woods. This time, the police followed him closely while the women stayed back. The police saw Mr. Ode enter a hidden clearing in the woods. There, he began to perform a strange ritual, chanting and placing pieces of meat into a large pot similar to the one in his house. The officers took photos and videos as evidence. Suddenly, Mr. Ode noticed the movement in the bushes and realized he was being watched. He grabbed the sack and ran deeper into the woods. The police gave chase, but Ode was swift and familiar with the terrain. He eventually eluded them, leaving the officers frustrated. They returned to Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola, showing them the evidence they had gathered. The women were horrified but also relieved that their suspicions were confirmed. The following day, the police organized a more extensive search of the woods, hoping to find where Mr. Ode was hiding. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola continued to act normal at the market, trying not to arouse suspicion. However, they couldn't help but feel anxious about what might happen next. That evening, Mr. Ode did not show up at the market. The villagers began to whisper among themselves, wondering where their favorite butcher had gone. Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola knew that they had to stay vigilant. The police continued their search, but Mr. Ode seemed to have vanished. Days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of Mr. Ode. The villagers started to believe he had left for good. However, Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola knew better. They kept an eye on the market and the woods, hoping to catch any sign of Ade's return. One night, as Mrs. Bisi was closing up her store, she noticed a shadowy figure moving near the edge of the market. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Mr. Ade's silhouette. She quickly called Mrs. Bola, and they decided to follow him once more. Mr. Ode moved cautiously, frequently looking over his shoulder. He entered a small, abandoned hut at the outskirts of the village. Bisi and Bola crept up to the window and peered inside. They saw Ade lighting candles around a large, eerie-looking altar. He seemed to be preparing for another ritual. Bisi and Bola knew they had to act fast. They quietly contacted the police, who arrived swiftly and surrounded the hut. Mr. Ode, engrossed in his preparations, did not notice the approaching officers. The police burst into the hut, catching Ode by surprise. He tried to escape, but this time, there was no way out. Mr. Ode was arrested and taken into custody. The police found more incriminating evidence inside the hut, including items that linked him to the missing people. Mr. Ode was taken to the police station for questioning. As he sat in the interrogation room, the weight of his actions began to settle on him. The police officers, armed with the evidence they had collected, started to question him about his activities. At first, Mr. Ode remained silent, staring at the table in front of him. But as the questioning continued, he began to break down. He confessed that he had been conducting strange rituals to gain supernatural powers, which he believed would help him acquire endless supplies of meat and wealth. He admitted that the pot in his house was enchanted, and the meat he sold came from these dark rituals. Meanwhile, the news of Mr. Ade's arrest spread like wildfire through the village of Ojo. The villagers were horrified and angry. They felt betrayed by the man they had trusted for so long. Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola were praised for their bravery in uncovering the truth, but they were also deeply shaken by the whole experience. Despite Mr. Ade's confession, the police knew they needed to gather more evidence to fully understand the extent of his crimes. They decided to search the woods and the hut thoroughly. In the hut, they found more ritualistic items, strange books, and other evidence that linked Mr. Ode to several missing persons cases. As the investigation continued, the villagers tried to return to their normal lives, but the shadow of Mr. Ade's actions loomed large over the community. Parents were especially wary, keeping a closer eye on their children and teaching them to be cautious of strangers. The market, once bustling and lively, was now filled with hushed whispers and suspicious glances. One evening, as Mrs. Bisi and Mrs. Bola were discussing the event over a cup of tea, they heard a knock on the door. It was an elderly man, a stranger to the village, who introduced himself as Baba Tunde. He claimed to be an expert in dealing with dark rituals and supernatural occurrences. He had heard about the troubles in Ojo and offered his help to cleanse the village of any lingering dark energy. Bisi and Bola, though initially skeptical, decided to take Baba to the police station to share his knowledge. The police, eager for any help they could get, allowed Baba to inspect the items found in the hut and the woods. Baba confirmed that Ade had been practicing dark magic and explained that the pot in his house was a vessel for trapping the souls of his victims. To break the curse and ensure the village was safe, Baba proposed a cleansing ritual. The police and villagers agreed, hoping to rid themselves of the fear and darkness that had settled over Ojo. They organized a community gathering at the market, where Baba would perform the ritual. As the night of the ritual approached, the villagers were filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. They gathered in the market square, where Baba had set up a makeshift altar. He began the ritual with chants and prayers, calling upon the spirits to cleanse the village. The atmosphere was tense, and everyone watched with bated breath. Suddenly, a strong wind swept through the market, extinguishing the candles Baba had lit. The villagers gasped as a dark shadow appeared, swirling above the altar. Baba remained calm, continuing his chants with more intensity. The shadow wavered, then slowly dissipated into the night sky. The wind died down, and the market square was silent. Baba declared the ritual a success, and the villagers felt a sense of relief wash over them. They thanked Baba for his help and vowed to protect their community from any future threats. If you have learned any lesson from this story, please share your thoughts in the comment section. To our returning viewers, we say thank you, and if you had not subscribed, please press the subscribe button to subscribe, also like and share to your friends and family. We all have something to learn from this. Thank you once again for watching. Bye for now.